Hey, thank you so much for joining us. We're here to talk about the future of work because, if you think about how we work, it's kind of like if you imagine it as a deck of cards, and then the pandemic caused us to throw all the cards up in the air, and now all the cards are sitting around the floor, and we're asking, like, when we pick these all up, do we really want to put them back in the same order again? Maybe not, right? That's the future of work. I'm Joshua McNichols. I'm a reporter for KUOW, Public Radio in Seattle.
And I'm Reema Khrais. I'm a reporter with Marketplace, and I am the host of Marketplace's podcast, This is Uncomfortable, which is a podcast about money and work. Thank you all for joining us today. For our virtual audience, we'd love for you all to be a part of the conversation. So if at any point you have questions, you can put them in the comments section. We'll be keeping an eye on the questions as they come in so we can bring them into the conversation, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can.
Yeah. Before we begin, we'd like to give a big thank you to our event sponsor, Primera Blue Cross. So thank you for your support.
All right, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests. Jason Wingard, he's a Dean Emeritus and Professor of Human Capital Management in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University and author of The Great Skills Gap, Optimizing Talent for the Future of Work. Welcome, Jason. And Margaret O'Meara, Professor in the Department of History at University of Washington and author of The Code, Silicon Valley, and the Remaking of America. Welcome, y'all.
Thank you.
So we're going to divide this conversation into three parts. And in the first part, we're talking to Jason a lot about, some of the biggest changes coming to how we work. And then in the second part, we'll hear from Margaret, a historian, about how these changes are rooted in some historical patterns. And then in the third part, we're going to bring it all together and reach some conclusions. So we're going over today some of the big changes on how we work and historical patterns, and then we're going to be taking your questions along the way. So Reema and Jason are going to start us off with a look at the future. So Reema, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah. So Jason, I want you to take us into the future, right? So we're just coming out of the pandemic and thinking big picture. How do you expect we'll talk about our jobs differently?
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here, Reema. I appreciate it. And Josh, into the future, the big picture. Well, we are not going to be working physically in the office every day, all day, the way we have been for a century. We're going to have a hybrid workplace to start coming right out of the pandemic. We're definitely not going to go from everybody working at home to everybody working back in the office again. And we're also not going to continue to stay fully at home. People are going to want to get out of their offices. So the research is showing us, and all the tallies are saying, the future is going to look like in 2021 and 2022, a hybrid environment. And people are going to be working at home and they're going to be working in the workplace, but the workplace is actually going to shift. It's not going to be the same kinds of offices and cubes. They're going to be reduced spaces in terms of how many a company has. Those spaces will be larger because they will be taking the place of creativity. This is going to be where people come and they convene to build culture, to build community, to think about how they can innovate. And then they will go home and they will do their productivity work. And then they will go to the coffee shop to do other types of work. So we're going to see a little bit of a hybrid type of a work environment, but the workplace that the company owns will be larger, more dynamic, more fun to attend.
So hybrid is really the key word there. It's not just remote work. It's, a couple of days at home. It's a couple of days in the workplace. And I really like thinking of it as like, this is the hub of where creativity happens, of where a lot of the thinking happens. And obviously we're talking about white collar work in that context.
That's exactly right. So professional work, it excludes manufacturing work where you're on the labor line, but white collar professional work, absolutely. There's going to be, actually, you use the right word, it's a hub and spoke model. I just wrote an article about this in Fast Company that came out 2 days ago. So you can check that out. But it talks about a hub and spoke model where on the one hand, companies are going to have fewer offices, they're going to be larger, they're going to be hubs of activity for socialization, but they're also going to be in different places. Some will be in the city, but then you will also have satellite offices in the surrounding suburban counties because people are going to be working in the suburbs and they're going to want to go to that hub in the city and then the satellite offices around the city. And you're going to see that more and more. And then we're going to see companies also starting to expand from where they are headquartered right now to other emerging markets. And you've started to see a little bit of that with Amazon and some other companies pre-pandemic. We're going to see a lot more of that now. Companies going to places like Detroit and Phoenix, places, Chapel Hill and Raleigh, places where they can spend less money and where their workers actually live.
I actually want to loop in Joshua for this because, Joshua, I know that you've been doing a lot of local reporting about what it looks like, what it may look like in Seattle. Do you have any specific examples?
Yeah, I think the biggest example of this is Starbucks. I mean, they've announced that they're going to take a year when their headquarters in Seattle's Soto neighborhood is vacated to basically just redesign it around this new idea of work. And they're talking about many of the things that Jason was describing. They're going to have less emphasis on having your own desk. Some people in some kinds of jobs still have to have their own desk, but a lot of people don't. And those people who don't may work from home more. And when they come to work, they'll reserve a spot. People call this hoteling. And, maybe sometimes they'll reserve a spot in a space that feels like a giant coffee shop. In Starbucks, that's a big thing for them. They love that kind of idea that you are productive in a coffee shop like environment. So in their headquarters, they have spaces that feel like a giant coffee shop, but they've also got different kinds of rooms for different kind of work you might have to do. You might need to, be brainstorming. And so you just need a spot at a table with a bunch of people who are brainstorming big ideas with you, or you might need a conference room, or you might need, some other kind of quiet room where you can concentrate, but you just have to be at the headquarters for some reason on that day. I've also interviewed architects about this, and some architects at NBBJ gave me some interesting insights. They say that, when you get out of college, or when you're in college, you learn to take control of your own environment. If you need to, study in a library, you go to the library, but or if you just need to go take a walk, you go do that, right? And one thing that happens after you graduate, if you went to college and then you went into an office, is they tell you, okay, now you're going to sit down in this spot for 8 hours and you're going to be productive. And they called that learned helplessness. They say, one thing we're doing during the pandemic is we're relearning how to take control of our own environment and do the things that we need to do to stay productive. And when we come back to offices, we will take some of those expectations with us and expect to have some control over where we are because we know what we need to do to be productive. Of course, like with gig jobs, it's a little different. Gig workers, people who are delivering, our groceries and our food. That's a very different environment. And one thing I'd love to hear more, from Jason and Margaret in this discussion is sort of like what happens with these kinds of jobs? How do they change? Right now, I'm hearing from a lot of gig workers that their work is they're getting less control over their job environment. They're competing more for because there are a lot of people who are out of work who are looking for these gig jobs. And they're competing more for the same delivery jobs, even though the number of people who ordering things by delivery has gone up. Also, the number of workers competing for those jobs have gone up. And so they feel like they've lost some control. And it seems like, when we talk about these new ways of working, we benefit from them a little bit differently depending on who we are. So Jason, I'd love to ask you a question. I'm kind of wondering what you think of that. I worry sometimes that this idea of the future workplace could be empowering for some people, but for others, it could be less empowering. I mean, how much skepticism should we bring to sort of these optimistic accounts of the workplace of the future?
Yeah, it's a great question, Josh. One of the things that we're learning, part of what's in my book is the great skills gap, is that employers are finding that the pace of change is happening so rapidly and the required skills that are needed to do the jobs that are changing so rapidly keeps evolving to the point where nobody's qualified to do the work. And so what do you do when the job's changing so much and the people who are doing the work don't have the skills to be able to do it? Well, you have to reskill them. They have to reskill themselves or you have to reskill them. And so what we're finding is there's this talent war, talent shortage for the right people with the right skills and a talent war to go out and find the right people. And what you're seeing there is sort of doubling down on one side of the fence or the other. So I'll give you an example. Amazon is saying, we are going to double down on retraining, retooling, upskilling our existing workforce. We see a lot of benefit in keeping the people we have. We recognize they're losing the skills that they need to be able to help us with the job of tomorrow. So we're going to invest, and it's been made a lot of headlines, $700 to $800 million, almost $1 billion in the next couple of years to retrain the people that they have so that they will be ready. And they're not training them, to be clear, on the jobs that they have right now. They're training them for what the skills they're going to need in the future are. Then you have on the other side of the fence, a company like Google, who have been dropping the number of full-time employees over the last couple of years. They had 200,000 full-time employees a couple of years ago. Now they're down to 100,000. And the reason is because they are not investing the same amount as Amazon in retooling their existing workforce. They're going out to the gig economy. To your point, Josh, there's all different types of contract workers, gig workers. There's some who do deliveries. There's some who do coding. There's some who do project management. And so Google's bet is we're not going to spend a lot of money trying to guess what skills our workforce will need next year and the year after that, or maybe even next quarter. We're just going to keep going out to the gig economy, and we're going to hire those people who have the skills that we need. And when they don't have the skills we need anymore, we'll let go of them and we'll get a new batch in. Now, you have very spirited people talking about the pros and cons of both of those models, but they both point to the same thing, which is individuals who are doing the work need to be reskilled and retooled on a constant basis. Gone are the days where you could go and get a college degree, maybe even a graduate degree. You could get a job at a place like Kodak or IBM, and then you could work for 25 years, collect your watch, and say, I really didn't have to do much other than a training every 5 or 6 years. My skills maintained throughout my career. Now you're lucky if your skills maintain for 1 year. And so that's why we have a talent shortage. That's why we have a talent war. And to answer your question directly, Josh, there's a real empowering opportunity for individuals, because you can go pick a company that's going to invest in you. It's going to give you transferable skills and reinvest in you to give you retooling and upskilling. Or if you don't want to do that, you can do it yourself. You can go out on the labor market and be a contract employee in the gig economy, and you can make sure that you possess the types of skills that you need. You can invest in certification classes on our programming and the like, and then Google will hire you to be able to come in. So I think it is an empowering opportunity for the labor force, but you have to now at this moment select whether you're going to go to a company and have them help you or whether you're going to do it yourself.
I think that's a great answer. We want to shift to a question, or I think we have a comment from someone. Seems like Travis on YouTube, he says, seems like Starbucks and coffee shops have potential to offer meeting spaces attached to their retail locations for teams and suburb to allow employees from other organizations who don't want to go all the way downtown to meet in the suburbs, I think is what that's. Okay. So it sounds like, do y'all understand that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of questions these days about real estate, right? And so coming out of the pandemic, you have a lot of companies, and Starbucks is one of them, that owns a lot of real estate. And as I said earlier, most companies are going to be reducing their real estate footprint. Now, the question that our viewer asked is, well, can you just latch on to the retail stores? In some cases, you may be able to do that. As Josh said earlier, the hoteling experience that some companies are starting to employ is sort of a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 model. 1/3 of your work you will do at home, 1/3 of your work you will do out at a coffee shop or a park or somewhere where you meet people, and then 1/3 will be at the corporate location, the hub, if you will, where you can do your creativity and collaboration and team building. Those types of activities probably wouldn't be latched onto the retail site, but it's possible. As I said earlier, what the research is showing us right now is that a company like Starbucks is getting much bigger spaces. They want spaces where you don't have individual cubes, you don't have little breakout offices, you have really wide open, big space where you can write on the glass and flip charts, and you can sit on the floor with beanbag chairs, whatever space you need, whatever tools, whatever equipment, so that you can be creative, so that you can have fun with your coworkers, so that you can help with the innovation and the creativity that will make that product or that service much better. That's the key. Then you go back home and you get on your computer and you do your productivity work.
We've got an audience question from Julie.
And we should say that if you've got a question for any of our guests, you can put it in the comment section on our YouTube stream, and that's where we're getting some of these questions here. Julie on YouTube asked, any tips for older workers? Is it still possible to specialize in a few things? And she mentioned copy editing, proofreading, writing, in my case, if you do those things really well.
That is a great question. it previews the kind of mentality and the attitude you have to have as a worker in this economy. You have to be flexible, and you have to ask the questions about what kinds of skills do I need? How broadly do I need to make sure that I'm prepared? And the answer is, not only do you have to be broader, you can have a specialization, but you're going to have a lot more areas of specialization if you want to remain competitive against other people who have the same types of broad areas of expertise. You're going to have it broad, it's going to have to be deep, and most importantly, it's going to have to be retooled on a constant basis. So we call it upskilling because you may not know a particular skill, and so you need to learn something. You need to take what you have and move it up. Retooling is another case. So reskilling, retooling means you may know how to copyright, you may know how to edit, but you need to learn a little bit about coding and programming as well, because what you used to be able to write and do in the copy editing system now has to be done in a digital format. And so you have to learn a little bit more on that front. So older workers are constantly asking, how can I remain relevant in the workforce? And the answer is you need to upskill, which means take the work that you already know, the skills you have, take it to another level. And you need to reskill, which means identify some things that are really popular and hot and train yourself on how to do those because you don't know how to do those. And if you take both of those, the combination is going to make you more competitive in the workforce.
And it seems as we're learning which of these two models is going to dominate the future, the one model where companies are helping unskilled or workers with one skill set retool for something else, and the other model that's more based on the gig economy where you kind of have to find the spot where you can hustle. These two models suggest different amounts of responsibility for workers to sort of retool themselves. And there's one possible future where you're just kind of on your own. If you don't have the right skills, you got to figure out a way to make it work.
Yeah, this is going to be the era where the responsibility, and people keep asking me the question, whose responsibility is it to make sure that the workforce is prepared? Is it the employer to do what Amazon is doing and to retrain and retool their people? Is it the individual's responsibility to go out on the labor market and to be in the gig economy, or even if you work for a company, to take it upon yourself to do the training? Or is it the university? Is it Columbia University where I work, or University of Washington where Margaret works? Is it our responsibility to do it? The one hole out of those three is the university. The reason why we're having this discussion is because the university has an age-old, for about 50, 60 years, the way in which education has taken place in the colleges and universities has been the same. We haven't changed with how the marketplace has changed and how the needs for skills have changed. And so now what we have is people are going to the university, going to college, getting a 4-year degree, thinking that this is the panacea for being able to be prepared for work. I'm going to spend money. It's really expensive. I'm going to take my primary years from 18 to 21, 22 years old. And then when I come out, companies like Starbucks and Amazon and Walmart, they don't want to hire me. They say, you don't have the skills that you need. So now we're right back to, are they going to pay the companies for you to be trained, or are you, after just having finished paying for college, going to pay to get yourself trained on top of what you just paid for? So the answer to the question, whose responsibility is, I really do believe it comes down to the individual employee who's going to be hired. You have to identify for yourself moving forward, is going to college the right thing for me? Is getting alternative education, micro-credentials and nano degrees, is that the right thing? Digital badges. Is it good for me to join a company when I'm younger and have them train me and give me the transferable skills I need? All of these choices about who's going to educate you, what skills you need, where you're going to place your allegiance, it's all on the individual employee. It's going to be a scary new world. And going back to the last question, that just means you have to have a broad set of skills, broader than you ever did. You can't specialize as much as you used to. Those are hard skills you need. And Josh, you need soft skills. So now you need to be able to collaborate. You need to be able to affect creativity and innovative new processes. You need to be able to manage people digitally and in person. All of those types of skills are going to be, the intangibles that are going to allow you to keep working as opposed to not working. But it's going to fall on the individual worker.
Before we move on to Margaret, there's this one comment from Brian on YouTube that I really sympathize with, and I'm curious to get your comments on it. Briefly. So he says, I hope the 40-hour work week goes out the window. I realize how much measuring productivity and performance is so much better than monitoring hours worked. I would also love like a 4-day week. What do you think about?
Well, I have some bad news for you.
It's not happening.
The good news and bad news. The good news is the 40-hour work week is going out the window. The bad news is it's going to be more hours. I don't know how many of you have taken count of how many hours you're working now during this pandemic, but when you have more flexibility of where you can work, in the office, in the hoteling space, at home, when you can work at night and have meetings, you're going to have more opportunity to be engaged in doing work than you ever did. It's more flexible, and people are clamoring for flexibility in the workplace, but it also is going to mean that you're going to be spending more time doing it. In terms of the measurement, I think the good news is that how we do work and what we do is going to be measured in a much more objective way. Subjectively, you know, when we're in the office and you hang out in front of your boss's office, when you go to the water cooler, when you spend time, you know, taking clients out to dinner, you have a subjective opportunity to wine and dine people, to use your social skills, to build relationships. All of that sort of clouds what kind of work you're actually doing. You know, you could be really successful and get promoted and somebody else is doing all the work. Now the playing field is level. The work that you are doing is the work that you're doing, and you have to be able to get it done. It's easy to measure it across a dashboard because we're doing so much more work, you know, online. Our productivity level at companies is going through the roof. The number of hours that people are working is also going through the roof. You can measure it objectively, which is good. It's good for diversity hiring. It's good for a whole host of things. What it's bad for is our mental health. So we're spending a lot of time talking with insurance providers and other mental health providers, because this is really stressful to be working as hard as we're working. We ask for flexibility, but now we can't manage all the different places we have to be, how long we're working, how much we're accountable for. It's really going to be difficult for people when it's so competitive out there to keep yourself trained and to know a whole lot and to work as much as you need to work. We're going to start to see the workforce break down.
That brings us to the second
Part of our conversation where, you know, a lot of these ideas, we're talking about the future, but we've heard some of these ideas before. There are some precedents, and many of these ideas are rooted in projects that have been underway for a long time. You know, as we mentioned at the top, Margaret O'Mara is a historian who's written a lot about the history of startups. So Margaret, when we talk about office work as something that can be done anywhere, I mean, it feels kind of new. I mean, remote work has been around for a while, but it's being broadly tested now and could lead to some permanent changes. You know, that broad testing of it is new, at least. You've written about Steve Jobs and his vision for the ideal office. And that vision was for a very specific kind of physical space. It wasn't a decentralized remote space. It was a very, you know, like Apple headquarters physical space. What would Steve Jobs have thought about these new visions of work?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. And, you know, there's funny because I think there are two sort of simultaneous things that are somewhat contradictory that run through both through the ideas that Steve Jobs has propounded himself, but also more broadly the tech industry. And one of those has been this idea that for creative work, for innovative work, for knowledge work, you need to have a very specific environment. You need to be in a place that has, you know, you're looking out at trees and there's a jogging path, or, you know, you're on some kind of corporate campus. And this goes back well beyond Silicon Valley itself. It goes all the way back to the early 20th century and to big industrial research labs of General Electric and AT&T, famous Bell Labs, you know, where the transistor was invented. This notion that knowledge workers need special environments, and they also need to be together. They need to have this sort of physical proximity. That's one idea. But the other idea that runs through is one that actually was kind of the premise of the selling the Apple II, selling the Apple's first products, which is that you have this desktop device, you have this desktop computer, and if it's connected by modem at first and then by the internet to other computers, then you have this tool for liberation. You can be anywhere. You have this, you are empowered by having this extraordinary machine on your desktop for creativity, for work, for all sorts of personal and professional expression. So this contradiction, I think we're still seeing this run through 2020, like thinking about, okay, what is the best kind of work environment, and how can technology, particularly computer hardware and software, how does that both unleash us from the office? But as Jason pointed out, it also takes, when you take the boundaries, the office walls away, at work just bleeds into everything. And we already had thrown work-life balance out the window before the pandemic hit. I think many white collar and I think all workers had a hard time delineating where work ends and home begins, and where everyone was overworked, and this accelerates it. So Steve Jobs, it's always interesting to think what Steve Jobs would say, but in a way, he's been kind of propounded these two visions that are somewhat contradictory.
And something I'm really curious about is, why haven't we seen a greater shift up until this point when it comes to remote work? Because from what I understand, people were experimenting with it in the 80s and then later as technology advanced in the 1990s, but it didn't really pick up. And right, so why didn't we see that?
Why not? I know, like, so we've had, so since the personal computer, arrived, the desktop computer arrived, you had futurists kind of saying this is the future of work. We can, Alvin Toffler, who was a best-selling journalist and futurist, wrote a book in 1980 that talked about the electronic cottage, that everyone's going to be working at home and going to be wired together. And this is going to be this is going to be good for society, for families. It's going to just change everyone's quality of life. Didn't happen. And then in the 90s, in the early days of the commercial internet, during the dot-com boom, there was lots of prediction of this is going to be, where everyone can move to a cabin in Montana and no one has to be linked, no one has to stay in Seattle or the Bay Area or New York. You can go. Did that happen? No. We had spiraling real estate prices in all of those places and even more concentration. I think a big factor was technological. Like we now have broadband penetration. We now have powerful enough devices that we can do what we're doing right here, right? We can have these sort of video conferences. We can beam them out to the world. That wasn't possible in 1997. And the other thing is, I think more fundamental, is organizational. And when the surveys were done in the 90s of why aren't more people telecommuting? Because they can. And it was really managers who were like, I don't believe someone's working as hard as if I can't see them working, I don't believe they're going to be doing what they need to do. There also was resistance from institutions and entities that were fighting for workers' rights too. In 1983, the AFL-CIO issued a proclamation against what they called computer homework, meaning what we now call remote work. Because when you take people out of the office and you put them in, whether it's a coffee shop or your home, you're taking away all the protections that both labor unions and then labor laws were designed to give workers, everything from an ergonomic office chair to limits on your work hours. And so this is kind of rubbing up against an infrastructure that's been built up for a century to protect workers, but really already was not really matching with the way we work now.
When I hear the way we talk about the future of work today, a lot of people are taking a sort of utopian stance on it and talking about this offering freedom and offering inclusion in a different way than before. But when you look back at some of these trends in history, were they sort of saying the same things? Was it about, bringing new people into the workforce, and how did that work out?
Yeah, in the 80s, it was the computer homework or working from home was seen as, among other things, something that would be great for working mothers, who were then at the time in the 70s and 80s white collar women coming into the workforce in larger numbers if they had younger children. And the notion was, okay, this is great. You have more flexible hours, you have all these things. And that there were certain jobs actually in the technology industry, like coding, that were very well suited. You didn't have to be in an office to write software. You didn't have to go to meetings for a lot of the things you did. And it didn't work out that way. And the reason it didn't, it's not to say that was impossible, but what happened and what is continuing to happen in 2020, 40 years after all these bold predictions, is that the expectations of and the rhythms of office work were unchanged. So there was still, again, this kind of idea that you've got to produce at a certain level. There's not going to be as much flexibility for, the workday being part of the workday being taken up by childcare. Maybe parents were in the home with their children, but they were still working. And both men and women who were these early pioneers of remote work in the 1980s, when reporters would interview them about what's your experience, they would say, well, it's great because I have, as Jason was talking about at the top, this kind of hybrid arrangement. We go into the office some of the time. But they would say, well, I'm always working. I never really get off the clock. That's the problem. It just never really stops because there's no kind of, again, the thing we're experiencing now, this has been a perennial problem because the organizational management structures, the way that we work, the way that companies run, the way that we've all designed our workspaces, particularly white collar workspaces, is not changed even though we're in different environments.
That's interesting. I'm thinking of
like recent news meetings I've had where my editor is talking to us about stories, and then her daughter comes in and kind of sits on her lap for a minute. And I imagine there are some spaces where that's kind of accepted, and some spaces where maybe it's seen as unprofessional. I'm not sure. But
yeah, I think it really depends. It's a whole range of experience. And I think there are huge upsides and opportunities. It is, this notion of hybrid work is something that, for example, white collar professional women, in the tech industry, for one, when you sort of look at what were the trend lines of why aren't more women moving up the managerial chain? Why are they leaving? It has to do with an inflexibility in this demand for face time, and tech companies. And again, I'm talking about a sector that I've researched and I know the best, but have been very, even though they build the software, many of them have had this culture, which is put a high premium on face time and showing up. And so you have parents, mostly mothers, leaving the workforce when they can't spend 60 hours a week in the office. They need to have some flexibility. They'd like to work at home a couple of days. So there are these opportunities created by this new world of work that's opening up. But it also has to recognize that, you need to create a place where if your kid comes and pops on your lap during a meeting, that's not a bad thing for your, that's something that's additive rather than detracting from what you're able to do at work.
Yeah. I'll go for it.
Well, so that it brings us to a question that came up in the YouTube comments, and I should say, we're gathering questions. People have left their comments in the YouTube's comment section. I'm wondering, Roland on YouTube asked, what are the key management competencies in this new distributed work model? I guess, that you talked about inflexibility, Margaret, but I wonder, Jason, because you're thinking about what companies need to do to be more responsive and more responsible to workers in this new era. How do we avoid that trap in the future, those traps that Margaret described? What do managers need to do?
Well, I think, first of all, Josh, they need to do what you just gave an example of. They need to model a different type of work behavior. We are in a new era. And I mentioned earlier that people's mental health is being affected because they're stressed out about their cat walking behind them, or their child coming in and making noise, or the Amazon guy ringing the doorbell, while you're on a Zoom call. And so one of the things that companies can do is make sure that the managers are trained on how to be a good virtual manager or a good hybrid manager. And that means changing thoughts and perceptions about when we work, where we work, making sure that you understand and appreciate that people are working all the time, and that when you don't see them, they are actually productive. And in fact, going to the other extreme and making sure to check them on not working too much, because we know from research that if your people work too much and they get too stressed out, their quality level goes down and the productivity level goes down. So the main answer to the question is managers are going to have to learn more how to be good virtual leaders. The problem right now is that most of the managers are still boomers and Generation X. And so it's sort of an old school mentality of, I need to see you, I want FaceTime, and that's going to be hard to break. The good news on that front, though, is that in about 3 or 4 years, 75 to 80% of the workforce is going to be millennials. So we're going to have the millennials and Gen Z in the workplace who have very different attitudes about when and where and how work gets done. And so it's going to be a game changer. And so we're in a period of transition right now as the older workforce starts to move out, and they're moving out at a faster rate because of the pandemic. They're buying houses in these Zoom towns and they're kind of hanging up. And the younger workforce is coming into play, and the new expectations and the new norms are being set right now. And it's exciting to see.
We have a couple more comments from listeners, and I'm gonna read a couple of them because they're in the same vein. So Brian, he said, our workplaces haven't changed, even though the way we work has. #truth, yes. And Julie on YouTube says, working from home worked well in the 90s with the help of a good childcare network. And that seems really key to me. And it reminds me of, you recently published an article, Margaret, and there was a line that really stuck out to me where you were like, Apple's new headquarters, when they opened in 2017, they featured these fancy new chairs and a 2-story yoga room, but something that was missing from the $5 billion facility is a childcare center. That's not even like within the realm of what is possible for them, right? That's not what they're not setting up. They're not thinking of families. And I think you even write that really their focus is on young, untethered people who can, dedicate all these hours. And so, yeah.
It's, and look, if someone leaves the workforce because it's incompatible with working at Apple, and being a parent of a young child isn't compatible, then they can find someone else to fill their job, right? And these campuses have been a huge tool for recruitment and retention, right? You offer all these amazing facilities, your yoga room, all those things. It reflects the mindset of the people who are, again, tech in particular has a big diversity problem, gender diversity, underrepresented minorities, and you can tell like the people who are making the choices about some of these things are not thinking where, what the needs might be. And there's also, the kind of work hard, play hard mentality of tech, which I think is important beyond the technology industry. And Jason, maybe you can speak to this more, which is, I see tech being the tail that wags the dog in terms of other industries, particularly white collar employers, like, oh, we need this talent. So to get this talent, that's what we need. And these campuses are designed to make you work really, really hard. And if you have your dry cleaner on site at the Googleplex, you do not need to leave to get your dry cleaning. If all your free food is there, and, name your tech company, why you don't have to leave campus to, you aren't spending an hour at lunch. And now here's another opportunity that remote work at scale provides, which is, okay, if you aren't offering the climbing gym and the massage room, what's the perk that you use to, and if these millennials who are coming into the majority are like, what my perk is, I would like a lunch hour. I would like no meetings between 12 and 1, like done and done, and what are the companies, how can companies, not just managers, but companies model a new, like, all right, I'm going to get the best talent by offering a much more humane workplace. Like, that's the thing. And I'm also going to capture this lost talent of people who have children and have this amazing, look, it is so, you invest so much in these folks, right? Someone works at Apple, or I'm not going to single out Apple, but, you work at a big tech company for, say, 5 or 6 years, and then you get to a point where either, the Bay Area is unaffordable, or you want to have kids, or something just makes it untenable, and there's no way to stay at that job and move to the next stage of your life. And so the company loses that person that they've invested in. And this is, this goes way, way back. I think this pandemic year has uncovered so many kind of structural deficiencies, not just in work, but in society. It's kind of laid them bare. And this kind of incompatibility of the way that work expectations in so many industries, how they mesh with, how they are coupled with a totally inadequate American childcare network and a school schedule that doesn't match work schedules, all the things that parents of all genders have complained about, right? Is now, we're realizing there are these structural things that are super hard to fix. So how do we, this is the challenge that awaits not only managers and executives, but all of us.
I'd love to
No.
piggyback on that if I could, Margaret, because this part of the conversation is where history really does meet the future. What we know about the past is that previous generations of the boomers and the Gen X, the way in which we were motivated is through compensation. And the expectation for being able to get a job and rise up through the ranks was to be at work and to do more, more, and more. And increasingly, to your point, the data just shows that people just started working more hours to the point where it was really untenable. But the way in which they got you to work more is by building these campuses, to your point, where they kept you because they had a dentist chair on the campus, or they had laundry, or cafeterias, things like that. This is where the future comes in, because what we're learning about the millennials and Gen Z in particular is this is the first generation in the history that is not conforming to the norms and expectations of what the employer wants. This generation is setting the terms. They are saying that, no, we are not going to do what you want us to do. We're not as extrinsically motivated by money as our parents and our grandparents were. We want more social justice. We want more communication. We want more flexibility. We want more meaning in the work that we're doing. We want very fair measurement, objective measurement, as I spoke about earlier. So no, Mr. Employer, you are going to conform to what we want. And so now employers are having to say, well, what is it that they want? And that's where we start to talk about the talent war. If we're going to have a majority of millennials and Gen Z in the workforce, and if the managers don't know what they want, don't know what motivates them, then you're going to lose the talent war, and you're going to lose in productivity, and you're not going to be a successful business. So now is where what I was saying earlier, this is where the history is starting. We can learn from history that the employers did everything that they needed to do to be successful before with the previous generations, motivating them with compensation, et cetera. Now we're going to have to shift that and give them more flexibility. So the hybrid work environment, the remote work environment, the shorter hours, the commitment to social justice, all the things you need to learn about how to be an effective manager in the virtual environment. All of that is starting to matter now. And it goes way back to a question that, Josh, you asked earlier, what needs to happen? What do companies need to do? Those are three things they need to do. They need to offer hybrid work environments. They need to provide skilling, upskilling and reskilling, and transferable skills. And they need to give people the time to feel like they are connected to the work in a very social justice oriented way. Those are three things that need to happen for this generation. And most companies aren't doing it yet because they're continuing to look back at history and doing what was successful before.
Yeah, I want to bring in non-white collar workers for a minute, because Vincent on YouTube raised, how is working changing for workers who aren't white collar? And it really strikes me that when we talk about workers sort of commanding, being in the commanding position here, so much of this depends on sort of how we're classifying these jobs and whether people are in a position to negotiate with their employers. It depends if they're in these higher income earning brackets. Yes, they can command those positions because software engineers are in such high demand. But in terms of unskilled laborers and even people who have skills, but who may not be paid as much, they may be working for an insurance company doing some, data entry or something, or they could be sort of in the gig economy where they have even, and we hear even, Uber and Lyft talking about, this is a job where you have control over your future. You can set your work hours and be your own boss, but there's these two sides to this because we're asking workers to take on more risk themselves, to take care of their own health insurance. And so how is work changing for workers who aren't white collar?
Well, I can certainly start. One of the things, it's the same, really. So we have white collar work and we have blue collar work. And people are asking about, well, what does that mean for the future for both? And it means you have to reskill constantly. It's reskilling and upskilling. It's just the nature of the skills may be different, but the process and the requirement and the expectations that the individual employee has are really the same. I can give you an example. So you look at Mercedes-Benz. They have an S-Class Mercedes-Benz. It's the highest Mercedes, most expensive, most technologically advanced car that they make. And so you have a whole host of assembly line workers who build this car, who build cars in general. What happened with the S-Class is it's so specialized that they needed a lot more robotic technology to build this car. what the workers were afraid of is, well, here we go. We're going to lose all of our jobs. We used to build these cars with care and love and precision, and now we have the robots coming in and they're doing the work. The answer wasn't that they were going to lose their jobs, though. They still needed as many people on that assembly line, even with all the robots coming in. But their work changed. You know, all the work that they used to do, the robots are doing. But now you needed the creative thought on the assembly line to be able to manage those robots. They call it cobots, right? So you need co-pilots for the robots to be able to maneuver them, to influence all the creativity, to be able to problem solve when something doesn't line up right, to be able to customize an order that a particular customer may have had, to be able to understand where there's efficiency gaps. All of that needs to be done by humans. But the people are saying, well, they took my job, but there's still another job for you. But what do you have to do? You have to retool. You have to upskill. Whose job is that? Whose responsibility is it? Is it Mercedes' responsibility or is it yours? In some cases, they would pay for it. In some cases, you have to do it yourself. So I did a talk, and all your viewers can look at it on, if you just Google, it's called Fearing the Future of Work. And so I talk a lot about this around blue collar workers and white collar workers, and where they both meet in the middle, there's the same need to retool and upskill. The real question is, whose responsibility is it, and are you willing to do it, and will you do it over and over and over again? That's where we get into this lifelong learning. You're going to have to learn as a job from now on. No longer can you learn and then get a job. Now learning is your job.
So we've come to sort of the third part of this conversation, and we've kind of already started to draw some of these threads together of the future and the past. But we're going to see if we can, reach some conclusions here. I guess, Reema, this is your turn to ask a question.
Yeah, I had a question for you, Jason, but you answered it earlier, trying to figure out who is actually going to drive this change. And it sounds like your answer for a lot of it will be from the actual workers themselves. It's not going to be so much of a top-down approach in terms of who's calling the shots. Well,
the answer actually is both. So
okay.
The actual answer is, in some cases, employers are taking on that responsibility, and they think that they're going to have a competitive advantage by both predicting what skills will be needed and then offering their people those skills. There's always been the concern around training that if you invest in your people and then you fortify them with these skills, that they may leave. They may walk with their feet and take that skill either on the open market to another company or go to the gig economy and do it themselves. But many companies are investing in that way, and then others, are not. And then it's allowing the individual employee. But back to an earlier question, it empowers workers now to be able to choose which model works better for them.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to ask Margaret,
because you've been talking about some of the unforeseen downsides of past efforts to go to remote work, for example. And, for example, I think, I don't remember if you said it this time or if I read it in your writing earlier, but when, efforts to do remote work sort of ended in the 80s, women sort of lost out. They couldn't go back. They were sort of last in, first out in some ways, and lost the opportunity to keep doing some of the coding work that they may have gotten accustomed to. But I'm wondering, when you hear these sort of future ideas of what work might be after the pandemic, what are the things that we could lose if things don't go according to plan, sort of as they may not have done in the past? I'd love to hear what you think of that, Margaret.
Well, I think, crisis is an accelerant. We see this throughout human history, right? So in a way, what we're experiencing today is this, we accelerated, look, we already had, I think, a significant chunk of the white collar American workforce was already working from home before the pandemic, and now more. We already had gig work. We already had this really thorny question of kind of how do you empower yourself, and how do you empower individually and collectively blue collar or workers, that the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, Lyft and Uber may say we give you control, but really they're the ones with the control. And so what I think about a lot, I'm thinking a lot about other moments of crisis and what sort of, how they accelerated things and what the results were. And also thinking going even further back, when we think about the future of, all this sort of disruption, technological disruption, social and political disruption of work, you go back to the earliest part of the Industrial Revolution itself. Like before factories, you had workers doing piecework they were in control of their own schedule. They, making shoes at their kitchen table before and then taking them into their employer. They were kind of like the Uber drivers of today. They had control, and when they went to the factory, they had to punch a clock and have a much more regimented life and have less control. And what they did is they banded, because they had individually had so little control in this larger system, they banded together into unions. And so what does the union of the future look like? The labor union of today may still, that organization, may work, still work, kind of transport to other current industries, but not all. Like, how do you organize gig workers or people doing a Mechanical Turk, like all this sort of larger landscape of labor where people are doing modern day piecework? What does that look like? So another moment that I'm thinking a lot about is the 1930s, which was a moment of crisis, economic crisis, which was an accelerant of existing things. One thing that Franklin Roosevelt's elected president in 1932, he comes in, the New Deal, this whole set of programs that transforms the role of the federal government in Americans' lives. But all the pieces of the New Deal were ideas that had been kicking around progressive, old style progressive political circles for like 3 or 4 or 5 decades. Like, people have been implementing them at the local and state level. And so we kind of have seen that now, these sort of, and it all stemmed from, hey, capitalism isn't working for everybody and it's too precarious, or the way that we're doing things isn't working. And then it was a matter of like economic precarity. You had these crashes and, people would lose all their money in the bank because there was no FDIC. And now the challenges are different, but I think that a crisis like this presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity, I think, for smart employers to think about, a way to use a more humane hybrid remote workplace as a way to recruit and retain. It provides an opportunity and probably will accelerate efforts to create, like, what's the new union, or what's the new mechanism by which blue collar or workers that aren't like as in demand, or whose skills, who haven't upskilled themselves into empowerment, how do they band together? Like, how do they work together, and what do they do to be a counterbalance to that? So these are, I think that the next decade is going to be, those are going to be really important things that are contouring what work looks like for a whole bunch of people.
And thinking about big moments in history, so we're talking about some big structural changes in terms of how we relate to work. And they're happening against a backdrop where more people and companies have become more aware of big structural problems like systemic racism. And, obviously we've heard from companies vowing to examine their own practices to be more inclusive and equitable. And, as we're thinking of these two things, changes to the office and corporate pledges to fight racism, I'm curious, Jason, like, how do you see them playing into each other?
Yeah, it's a great question, Reema. It really plays into, in the first place, the generational evolution that I was talking about earlier with millennials. So if you get back into, millennials are going to be the majority of the workplace, and they have their own terms. What are those terms? One of the terms is to be more socially justice oriented as an organization and as managers. So what does that mean? That means that they actually want the company to stand for something. They want the leader, the manager that they work for, to be more authentic and more forthcoming with what they believe in. The key here is, it doesn't matter, the data shows it doesn't matter what they represent and what they believe in, but it has to be something. So because of social media and because of the way that the millennials are intrinsically motivated, then it's important to them to be able to, on their devices, through all the social channels and with their network of people, to be able to say, this is where I work. Oh yeah, that's the organization that was against or for immigration. That's the organization that is supportive of this, that, or the other, right? And so being able to talk about that is really important to them as a function of where they work. In the past, it was absolutely taboo, right? And so I'm sure Margaret could talk about this. You do not bring politics, you do not bring social issues into the workplace. That's for home. Here, we're all about business. Now you need to be all about social issues. So I did some work with PepsiCo. And PepsiCo, if you want to look at one of the companies that did a really good job following the George Floyd issue and just responding to the moment when people were wondering what was going on and how companies should respond. Lots wrote letters, but PepsiCo in particular did a step further. They wrote a letter of support, but they also created a dashboard and said, here's the commitment that we've already made, and here's how we're going to one up that and showcase how we're going to invest in Black communities, how we're going to invest in more gender diversity in the leadership ranks, et cetera, et cetera. So they actually said, we care about this and we're going to do something. And I mentioned that because this workforce, the millennial workforce, the workforce of tomorrow, that's going to be the majority, is expecting that more companies do that. And then you go down a level deeper and you say, well, who do you work for? Okay, well, I work for Margaret. Well, what does Margaret believe? What does she say on her social channels? When she's out there in the media, is she talking about what she's supportive of? Or is she really agnostic and all about the numbers and all about the business? I don't want to work for somebody who isn't talking about what they believe. I want Margaret to be more authentic. I want her to tell me and the world what she believes in and how this company is supporting those things. And that I can decide for myself whether I want to be part of that or whether I don't. So what it means is that there's going to be more diversity in the workplace now, and that the millennials will be happier with the organizations that they choose.
Yeah, Jason, you're exactly right. This is really unusual that these that big major corporations are being asked to take a stand and not just write a letter, but to do more. And also that people see, back in the day, sure, you had CEOs that were, were supporters of one party or another, or had their own politics. But if you worked for that company, GE was, it had a certain politics. But if you work for GE, you didn't feel like, oh, this is me, this is my identity is this. And so this is a confluence of your job is so much of who you are, and politics has become everything. So it's it's new territory for corporate America. And it's really interesting seeing how they're navigating it.
Absolutely. A lot of risk that you have to take at this point.
Yeah.
To the end of this, we've got time for one or maybe two more audience questions, depending on how quick they are. Vince on Facebook said, could gig work and technology work that enables remote work exploit workers who fall outside of traditional employee relationships and that lack benefits and legal protections? I don't know who wants to answer that.
Yes. Yeah, I think I think this is also, I think Jason's right in that this is up to, employees to fight for their skill up and fight for their rights, or, empower themselves, but also for employers to not exploit. And also it's a matter of public policy too. It's for policymakers to think about what are the guardrails, what are the rules for this new economy? Because the other thing I think has been a real challenge is that we are working with labor laws from the 1930s when the world of American work was wildly different. And so that's why in many cases, executives and employees alike can find them onerous. Like, how does this apply to me? Like, what is this? This is a bunch of red tape. So we need a real revision and update for what the 21st century reality is.
That brings together some threads. I know, Margaret, when we spoke once earlier, you talked about the interesting pattern where some white collar workers at Amazon were sort of coordinating with some warehouse workers at Amazon, and that this partnership was something kind of new. It's not exactly a union, but it's a case where even though we've got these two different economic classes that are maybe experiencing the new workplace differently, when these workers who come with values, as Jason described, choose to sort of stand with workers who are maybe vulnerable to some of this exploitation in different ways. I don't know, that's one new trend that we see, I guess, that could address some of these things.
For sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. So Reema, I think that's about all we have time for, right?
Exactly. I'm looking at the time, like, oh, it's already 5. Yeah, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you all so much for joining. Again, Jason and Margaret, yeah, for everyone who tuned in. And again, Jason, he is the Dean Emeritus and Professor of Human Capital Management in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University, and Margaret O'Mara, Professor in the Department of History at the University of Washington, author of The Code, Silicon Valley, and the Remaking of America. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all. And thanks, listeners. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions.
I
but-
know, there were so many. They were great.
Yeah. Oh, and thank you, Reema Khrais, host of Marketplace's This Is Uncomfortable podcast. I've been practicing saying your name correctly. And I'm Joshua McNichols
That's
from
great.
KUOW. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye.
now.